Welcome to this week's edition of Insights with Eric Hacopian. This week we're going to discuss two primary issues. One of them is the ongoing crisis at our borders, and the second was going to be the election process that we're having for June 20th to choose our next prime minister. Let's start with the situation at the border. Both in the Syunik and the Gegharkunik provinces, essentially what happened last week still stands, i.e. Azeri troops have illegally crossed our borders into internationally recognized Armenian territory and have set up forward camps. Since then, there have been multiple incidents, the most critical of them being 2 days ago when one of our troops was shot and killed at a distance in the Gegharkunik region of our borders. And this morning, we learned that 6 of our soldiers have been essentially kidnapped or taken as prisoners of war on our territory. Outside of that, for the most part, what we have seen all week is these, I would say, rather absurdist videos and photos of our troops and Azeri troops fighting each other with sticks and stones, sort of like ultimate fighting type struggles at the border. One of which lasted for more than an hour, after which 30 Azeris and 11 Armenian soldiers were sent to their respective hospitals. Obviously, this is a very dangerous situation. These provocations from the Azeri side can very easily stumble us into a shooting war. This has to stop. Otherwise, we might be looking at far more serious situations. As this crisis continues, I think we're getting a clearer and clearer understanding of what is the genesis of this current round of Azeri aggression against Armenia proper itself. I think the first thing that is very clear is that the Azeri side is not happy with the current status quo, specifically as it relates to Karabakh. And I think that the heart of this matter is the demarcation issue, which is an issue that has been talked about for a week or 10 days. Now, what is demarcation? Demarcation is essentially establishing consistent borders where everyone knows what is what based on international maps of what we've had, essentially in our case from Soviet times. Let's be clear about one thing. Demarcation in and of itself is not a bad thing. In fact, it is something that can bring security and clarity for people living on the borders. However, as with anything, especially in this part of the world, the devil is in the details. Because the demarcation issue when it comes to Armenia and Azerbaijan, depending on how it's worded, and I'm assuming what the Azeri side wants is for Armenia to say these are our borders, and essentially by declaring borders, specific borders with Azerbaijan, not having any claims about the sovereignty in Artsakh, the rights of the people in Artsakh to rule themselves and have sovereignty, and eventually have independence as an independent state, a right that they have earned, deserve, and given the genocidal nature of the Azeri regime, are well within international rights to demand. I think there are ways to reach an agreement in demarking this border between Armenia proper and Azerbaijan without making that concession. I think what is driving this current confrontation and these issues are that the Azeris want to impose their will on us to have this language and this demarcation issue be done in such a manner that essentially deals with the Artsakh issue from the Armenian side without ever mentioning Artsakh. That is something that is not acceptable to our side and is something that we need to all unite behind, not to allow to happen. Let's move on to elections. Generally in the world, there's essentially two kinds of elections in democratic countries. One are the elections of hope, and the other one are the elections of fear. What we have in Armenia on June 20th are going to be the elections of fear. Now, that fear is quantified in two specific ways when it comes to our case. The first one is the fear of the insecurity in the country, the political instability, and specifically the physical safety of the country based on what's going on in our borders. I would say at this moment that is the primary fear that is driving the country and the motivations of voters. The second fear, which is significant, and shared by many people, specifically, most specifically, by people who are supporters of the current prime minister, is the fear of the return of the old regime. So I think what we're going to be looking at, and in that, when I mean by old regime, specifically in this case, is about the former president, Robert Kocharyan, not far less so the other groupings that are on the opposition side. What we're really looking at over the next few weeks in this election process is which fear overcomes the other. If anything that involves fearing the security situation is going to help the opposition, anything that involves fearing the return of the old regime is likely to help the prime minister. Given what I just described, I have some words of advice for our prime minister if he was ever to ask me about how he should approach the situation and what it all means. I know there have been countless polls which show the prime minister winning this election. In fact, there's never been a poll that doesn't show him in first place, and I suspect there's not likely a scenario in which he doesn't finish in first place. However, what he needs to understand is that none of those numbers mean anything. Because if the issue becomes security, and if people are ever forced to choose between security and freedom and democracy, and if that is the only choice, and it's a binary choice, people will choose security. There's, in fact, a long history of it in democratic countries. We saw this with Charles de Gaulle in the 50s in France. We saw it in the early 2000s with Ariel Sharon in Israel. People will vote for people who they don't like if they think those people will provide security. The job of the prime minister, and frankly all forces, democratic forces inside and outside of Armenia, is to make sure that that is not the binary choice. Because as I said, if that's the binary choice, people will choose security. And I must add, people will not be wrong to choose security, because after all, the first mandate of any state is to the protection of its citizens. And if a country cannot protect its citizens and its borders, it has no mandate to do anything else. What can bring about the situation that we don't have this binary choice? And that is for the prime minister to act decisively, specifically in the front of defending the country and the army. You must act decisively to fire the incompetent. You need to act decisively to bring in people among the army staff, whatever their rank, that can take control of the situation, someone who has, or groups of people that have the confidence of our troops, that can fight and defend our borders. The issue here is competence. Frankly, rank does not matter. The army needs to be reformed. If there are junior officers that need to be promoted above their generals, if they're capable, if they can lead people and they can fight, they should be promoted. This is not about being nice. It is not about following procedures. It is about being effective. This is what we need to understand collectively about our armed forces. Unlike other countries, in Armenia, the army is the people are the army. The fact is that the leadership of the army, not the foot soldiers, the leadership of the army has lost the confidence of the people. What this means is that the prime minister needs to act decisively to reform the army, bring in competent people that can defend our borders. Because failure to do so is likely to mean that the people will choose someone who can do those things on June 20th. In conclusion, what is clear to me is that we're in for a long struggle. The nature of the regime in Baku is such that it will consistently and constantly try to challenge us. This will require us to learn to act in different ways. What's key for us is two things. One is to never lose our composure, be firm in what we need to do, and most importantly, have national unity when it comes to the issues of national security and defending our borders. What people need to understand is that our democratic processes can go on. We can argue, fight, have elections on multiple different things. But what people need to understand that when it comes to our borders, politics and our electoral struggles against each other stop way before our borders. Lastly, what does all of this lead to? What this leads to is the understanding is that regardless if we have the current government stay in power or we have a new government post June 20th, the number one, number two, number three tasks of this state is the rebuilding of our army into an army that can act in forceful ways to defend our country. Regardless of our politics, this should be our collective task and our collective mandate. And any government that is involved in reforming the army, strengthening it in a way that it can defend the country, should have all of our support, regardless of ideology, regardless of who we like or who we don't like. That is our task for the next few years. Thank you for joining me for this week's Insights with Eric Hacopian.